Terrorists attack the heart of America. Hijacked planes smash into New York's tallest buildings. The World Trade Center collapses with thousands trapped inside. Another airliner then flew into the Pentagon. The White House says those who carried out the attacks will be hunted down.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
This is BBC News. I'm Deborah Mackenzie.
And I'm Bill Turnbull. Thousands of people are feared dead after a devastating series of terrorist attacks on the United States of America. At around 9 a.m. local time, hijacked passenger aircraft were flown deliberately into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Within the next 2 hours, the center of Manhattan's business area lay in ruins after the twin towers of the Trade Center, America's two tallest buildings, collapsed. All air traffic in the country was suspended and security forces put onto a state of the highest alert. President Bush, who'd been visiting Florida, was evacuated to a nuclear bunker from where he pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible. The first blow was struck at 8:45 in the morning, New York time. A hijacked airliner carrying dozens of passengers flew straight into the World Trade Center's North Tower with devastating effect. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet struck the Trade Center's twin South Tower, exploding in a huge fireball. Next, it was the turn of Washington and the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, deliberately flown into the side of the building. As panic spread on the streets, all civilian flights were grounded. New York's stock exchange was suspended and the White House was evacuated, along with thousands of personnel in other government buildings. Then the unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed. Followed minutes later by the center's second tower, the building symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. No one knows how many have died. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. Well, we can go now to Washington and get the latest situation from our correspondent Tom Carver. And Tom, President Bush has spoken to the nation within the past half hour.
That's right, yes. He gave what is undoubtedly the most important address of his life, essentially. His aim was to try to reassure the American people and to remind them that they would stop at nothing to hunt down the killers. He talked about how the terrorists may be able to destroy the foundations of buildings, but would not destroy the foundations of America. He said that he had implemented the government's emergency response plans and that tomorrow government offices around the country would reopen and that America's economy would reopen. Perhaps the most significant statement came when he said, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed this act and those who harbor them." A clear indication that America now plans to go after not just the terrorists that carried it out, but any country, indeed, that may be thought to have bankrolled the terrorists or to be hiding them. Well, let's now look back on the day's events. James Robbins has this report.
It should have been a perfect day. But just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. No one yet knows who piloted these planes to destruction, but they could not have been targeted with greater accuracy. The extraordinary impact of the second plane, the 767, was witnessed by many who simply didn't realize the full enormity of what was happening. Nor could they know the implications of a huge airliner laden with aviation fuel exploding deep inside one of the world's tallest buildings. They certainly didn't realize the twin towers of the World Trade Center were now completely doomed.
Wow, do you see this aircraft? I've got it all.
By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
Another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God! My own eye. Just went in. Must be a car. Oh my God! Another plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
It's just...
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital, too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed, and it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Big boom, come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy, crawled out, kept getting hit in the head, had bags thrown around. Finally, we fought our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, more news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow, American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
In the past hour, President George W. Bush made a television address to the American people, and again he said he would do everything possible to bring those responsible to justice.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
This is BBC News, a summary now of the main news. America and the rest of the world is in shock following catastrophic terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. Several thousand people are thought to have lost their lives when two hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the side of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during Tuesday morning's rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain. And we held on to each other, and he flashed a light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first two strikes, another hijacked Boeing passenger plane crash-landed near the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. A fourth airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. President Bush has addressed the American public to give his reaction to the terrorist attacks. He said all efforts were being made to track down those responsible and that world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism. Mr. Bush said the U.S. would make no distinction between terrorists and those who harbored them. He said no one would forget that day, but America would go forward. The number of casualties may not be known for some time, but the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, says the figure will be more than any of us can bear. Rescue workers are being hindered by a thick fog of ash, fumes and debris from the ruins. Some 260 people died on board the planes. The American Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said the Pentagon was functioning and would be open on Wednesday. He said the United States was in no way connected to explosions that have been occurring in the Afghan capital, Kabul, in the last few hours. American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. There's been widespread condemnation of the attacks from international leaders. The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said it was a war between terrorists and the free world.
As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity.
Both President Bush and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon have said those behind terrorist attacks will have nowhere to hide. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin spoke of inhuman attacks.
Well, the attacks that we've all seen have stunned Americans and brought condemnation, of course, from around the world.
Americans are still coming to terms with the scale of today's onslaught. These are shocking events that no one in New York's financial district will forget. As America's cities burned, President Bush pledged to find those responsible.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
The world was transfixed as television showed stunned people escaping from streets filled with dust and smoke. In Britain, domestic events were put on hold. Tony Blair called on all democracies to stand together to fight fanaticism.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
As the day developed and the full horror emerged, statesmen from around the world expressed their condolences. The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat was one of the first to send his sympathies to the American people.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Speaking to the BBC's Hard Talk programme, Ehud Barak, Israel's former Prime Minister, also condemned today's events.
We are facing a growing wave of terror. Our hearts and souls are now with the American people and its leadership, and the devastating, painful kind of consequences.
The knock-on effects are enormous. In the short term, air travel to and from the United States is in disarray. At Gatwick, passengers were told flights were being recalled or cancelled. At American embassies around the world, people have been laying flowers and leaving messages. Tonight, Americans at home and abroad have been warned to stay alert. Helen Callahan, BBC News.
Well, as President Bush mentioned in his address, the hunt for those responsible has already begun. In the studio with us now is Dr. Martin Navius, who is a defence and security analyst. Where do they start looking?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to find direct evidence linking any particular terrorist group to this particular terrorist outrage. So the United States has basically two options. It can continue to seek such direct evidence, in which case it will be frustrated, or it will take a very long time in which to locate that evidence, and then that evidence will always be contested, or it can make a general determination that a list of terrorist groups or a terrorist group is responsible for this outrage and therefore must be held responsible.
So it's going to be circumstantial evidence, more or less, on which they base their decision?
I think, unfortunately, we cannot look at quasi-legal approaches to dealing with terrorism. What has to be taken is a political decision and a military decision that various groups are to be held responsible for this, and those groups and those countries that support them will be punished.
Yes.
The United States has to act. President Bush's presidency will be judged by how he deals with this crisis, not by how he deals with the faltering US economy. And therefore, we can expect that over the next few days or few months, United States forces will be ready to launch attacks somewhere, certainly in Afghanistan and possibly elsewhere.
Right, I was going to come on to that because President Bush saying that the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbour them. If this was carried out by an Islamic militant group, which countries should be looking over their shoulder?
Well, the question is how wide the United States wants this war. If Osama bin Laden is going to be the only objective of US policy, of US military action, and if Osama bin Laden is located in Afghanistan, then the United States can fight a limited war, provided they can find where he is hiding. If the United States decides that what they are going to undertake in view of the scale and scope of the outrages committed in New York today is a broader war, that is not simply going after one or two individuals or one small organization, but going after a whole range of terrorist organizations located across the length and breadth of the Middle East and elsewhere, then we are going to see a long, drawn-out and bloody conflict in which there are going to be casualties on both sides, because enormous collateral damage and political costs.
Because there are other countries with whom Osama bin Laden has been associated. Sudan, Syria, Iraq?
Well, the United States has identified a number of, in the past, has identified a number of countries which have been supportive of terrorism, terrorists. These have included Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, as you mentioned, and Sudan, as well as Libya, and possibly a number of others. If the United States is going to hold all these countries responsible, then we are going to see quite an extensive campaign that will have enormous military and political consequences throughout the world.
Dr. Martin Navis, thank you very much. We can get more reaction now from Washington by joining Mark Plotkin, who's a commentator for US National Radio. And Mark, presumably the shockwaves still reverberating across the American nation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is, to say it is unprecedented would be a slight understatement, to say the least. This has been called a second Pearl Harbor. We had an isolated incident of Oklahoma City. Yes, there was a bombing in World Trade Center, but 4 commercial airlines, the Pentagon, which is the military center of the nation, and the financial capital of the world, New York City. If this was on a movie, people would walk out of it because they would feel that it was implausible and unbelievable.
How long do you think before America can come to terms with this?
Well, I don't think they'll ever come to terms with it. I think everybody will date this day like they did. The only thing I can compare it to in my life is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That is the significance of it, where you have the president returning to Washington, where you didn't know for some time where he was, and then people are still very tense about if there are going to be further attacks. We have this sort of sense of invincibility, that things that happen all around the world won't happen to us. Now there is a certain psychological terror, a certain uncertainty, a certain tentativeness that we as a nation probably never had before.
At times like these, America particularly looks to its leader for comfort and leadership. Do you think people will have been convinced by President Bush's performance?
Well, you know, this was a test for him. This was a person that was considered maybe not up to the job, not a man of the most conscientious seriousness, somebody that was going to really have to really strive to be taken seriously. He was characteristically brief, as I've said to other medium, 4 minutes and 21 seconds. I think he could have spent a little longer. But he probably said the right things. The most important thing he said is that the America will be open for business, meaning that we will continue to be strong and we will continue to function.
Mark, you're just a couple of miles there from the other appalling outrage carried out when one of the planes crashed into the Pentagon. Can you bring us up to date at all on what casualties are estimated to be there?
Well, it was quite a while before people were even allowed in there. The Pentagon, as you know, is not, or maybe your viewers don't know, is not in Washington, D.C. It is about a mile and a half outside Washington in Virginia. And the point is that there are people at the hospital, but we don't really know how many people perished there, and they, for many, many hours, weren't even able to get into the Pentagon. We are assured that all the top military people, including the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the heads of all the military services, are safe. But there are many employees, and we are not getting firm numbers. But it wouldn't be unrealistic to think that there would have been hundreds of people killed there in that building.
Mark Plotkin in Washington, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is BBC News. Let's get a summary now of the main news from the United States. The terror attacks on New York and Washington.